She walked into the bank dressed in old, torn clothes. Everyone laughed until she opened her bag. What happened next left the entire room speechless. This story will change how you see truth, power, and justice. Watch until the very end. You won't believe what unfolds. If this story moves you, don't forget to like the video, share it with others, and subscribe to the channel. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from. The cold afternoon light filtered through the tall windows of the Chase Bank in Rockview, casting long shadows across the polished marble floor. Clients in suits waited impatiently in line, scrolling through their phones or tapping their feet. The air was filled with murmurs, the occasional clink of coins, and the steady clicking of keyboards behind the counters. No one expected anything unusual. Until she walked in. The door opened with a low creak, and an elderly black woman slowly entered the bank. Her posture was bent but proud, her movements deliberate. She wore a long, dark brown coat, patched in several places and covered in years of dust. Her silver hair was tied back loosely, curls slipping free, and her shoes were worn almost to the sole. On her shoulder hung a frayed canvas bag, faded and bulging slightly with unseen weight. Her name was Mrs. Elijah Kirby. She moved with purpose, but silently, as if the room itself wasn't meant to notice her yet. But they did. A few heads turned. Then came the whispers. A sharply dressed middle-aged white woman at the ATM clutched her purse closer, eyeing the old woman with caution. A pair of bank tellers, Josh and Martin, watched her approach with amused curiosity. "Probably lost," Josh muttered with a chuckle. "Or thinks this is a shelter," Martin added, smirking. Mrs. Kirby reached the center of the lobby and stopped. All around her, activity continued, but an unmistakable tension began to form in the air. She looked around calmly, her deep brown eyes scanning the faces that stared back at her with confusion, annoyance, or outright disdain. Then, in a quiet but unwavering voice, she spoke. "This bank," she said slowly, "belongs to me." The room fell still. A few seconds passed in stunned silence before the laughter began. It started with a chuckle near the back, then spread like wildfire. Some customers laughed openly, others shook their heads. Josh and Martin leaned over the counter, openly snickering now. "That's a new one," Josh said. "She thinks she owns the place." Stephen Miller, the tall white security guard near the entrance, stood up straighter, frowning. He was known for his no-nonsense attitude and aggressive style. His hand casually dropped to his belt, resting near his gun holster. With firm steps, he approached the elderly woman. "Ma'am," Stephen said, his tone sharp and patronizing, "this isn't a place for whatever this is. You need to leave before we have a problem." Mrs. Kirby turned her head toward him, her expression calm, unreadable. "I'm not here to cause trouble," she said. "I've come to take back what's mine." Stephen gave an incredulous snort. "Yeah? And what exactly is that?" "This bank," she said again, louder now, "Chase Bank, founded in 1948. By me." Gasps and more laughter erupted. One man near the back said loudly, "Someone call a hospital." But she didn't flinch. Instead, with deliberate movements, she slowly bent down and opened the flap of her canvas bag. Stephen's stance shifted slightly, his eyes narrowing as he instinctively gripped the handle of his weapon tighter. Others leaned forward, curious despite themselves. From the bag, Mrs. Kirby pulled out a bundle wrapped in aged cloth. She set it gently on the floor and began to unfold it. Her fingers trembled slightly, but her motions were steady. One layer of cloth, then another, until a weathered leather ledger appeared, yellowed pages peeking from its sides. Alongside it were stacks of old currency, banknotes bearing a Chase logo that hadn't been used in decades. The room quieted again, this time with something else: uncertainty. Mrs. Kirby stood up straight, holding the ledger against her chest. "This is the original ledger of Chase Bank," she said. "The first one. My name is in here. I am Mrs. Elijah C.K. Kirby, and this bank was stolen from me." For a moment, no one moved. Stephen took a step back, his face contorted with confusion. James Temp, the bank manager, appeared from behind the glass counter. In his 40s, clean-cut and confident, he walked toward the disturbance with practiced control, clearly prepared to dismiss whatever spectacle was occurring. "Ma'am," he said, his voice measured, "this bank has been owned by the Matthews family for 3 generations. You must be mistaken." "I'm not," Mrs. Kirby replied firmly. She placed the ledger on a nearby table and began to flip through it, stopping at a page with 2 faded signatures. "Here is mine, Elijah C.K. Kirby, and here," she tapped the second name, "was my partner, John Williams." James leaned in, his professional smile faltering. The names were there, clear as day, written in an old-fashioned hand, the ink faded but unmistakable. For a brief second, something flickered in his expression. Doubt, perhaps, or realization. Stephen's frustration boiled over. "This is a scam," he barked. "This woman's wasting everyone's time." He turned to James. "Want me to call the police?" Mrs. Kirby's voice cut through the room before James could respond. "I have come here not to beg, not to plead, but to show the truth. Something was taken from me long ago, and today I begin the work of taking it back." Her voice carried a strength that silenced the lobby. Even those who moments ago laughed now looked at her with uncertainty. The ledger lay open before her, the old banknotes scattered across the marble like fallen pieces of forgotten history. James didn't respond. His eyes remained fixed on the page in front of him. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the energy in the room shifted, from mockery to unease, from disbelief to something more unsettling, the possibility that she might be telling the truth. The chapter ended not with shouting, but silence. Heavy, uncomfortable silence, as an elderly woman stood alone in the center of the bank, no longer invisible and far from done. The silence that had settled over the lobby of Chase Bank was thick with disbelief and discomfort. James Temp stood frozen beside the open ledger, his eyes still on the faded signature that read Elijah C.K. Kirby. Around him, employees whispered quietly among themselves, and the customers, who moments ago had been laughing, now shifted uneasily in place. The air felt heavier, as though the past had come rushing into the present, demanding attention. Mrs. Elijah Kirby remained at the center of it all, her aged hands resting gently on the ledger. Her posture was straight despite the years, her expression calm but resolute. The worn canvas bag lay beside her feet, half open, revealing more documents bundled tightly together with old cloth. No one moved to touch them. James finally looked up from the page. This can't be real," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. His usual confident tone was gone, replaced by something hesitant, almost fearful. "I've worked at this bank my entire adult life. I've studied its history. I've never seen or heard your name in any of the official records." "You wouldn't," Mrs. Kirby said evenly. "They made sure of that. They erased me." Stephen Miller, the security guard, let out a low scoff. "Erased you? Lady, I don't know what kind of story you think this is, but this bank has been owned by the Matthews family since the beginning. Everyone knows that." Mrs. Kirby turned her head slightly toward him, her gaze steady. "Everyone knows what they've been told to believe," she said, "but I remember. I remember everything. In 1948, I stood in front of a crowd not so different from this one and declared my dream to build a bank that would serve everyone fairly. I was laughed at then, too, but I built it anyway. I built this place with my own hands. Until they took it." James shook his head slowly, stepping back from the table as if afraid to be near the truth. "Who took it?" he asked, his voice quieter now. "My business partner," she answered, her voice gaining strength with every word. "John Williams. He was the man I trusted most. We built this together. We opened our doors with a promise to serve the people. But when the bank started to succeed, he began meeting in secret with the Matthews family. They said the bank's reputation would suffer if people knew it was founded by a black woman. They told him no one would deposit their money here. And he listened." She paused for a moment, her eyes closing briefly as though the memories weighed too heavily. Then she opened them again, and her gaze was sharper than before. "They forged documents, removed my name from the ownership papers. They created a new narrative, one where I never existed. I tried to fight back. I had lawyers. I went to court, but no one listened. Back then, a woman like me, black, poor, and loud, was easy to silence. The room remained quiet. Even Stephen didn't interrupt this time. Customers, who had stood with their arms crossed now, had their hands at their sides. A few looked at the ground. The young employee, Emily Carter, near the back, watched the scene unfold, her brow furrowed with something close to sympathy. James turned toward the old woman again, his composure eroding. "If what you say is true, if all of this really happened, why come back now? After all these years?" Mrs. Kirby looked down at the worn pages, her fingers brushing the ink as if it were sacred. "Because I finally have the proof," she said. "For decades, I held on to this ledger, these bills, these papers. I didn't just lose a business. I lost my name, my voice, my place in history, but time has a way of bringing things full circle, and now I've returned to restore what was mine." Stephen took a step closer again, shaking his head, frustration bubbling back to the surface. "And we're just supposed to believe you, because you show up here with some old books and a story? You want us to rewrite everything because of a memory?" Mrs. Kirby did not raise her voice. She did not flinch. "No," she said softly. "I want you to open your eyes, to see what they tried to bury." She slowly knelt down beside her bag, reaching for another bundle. The fabric unwound carefully, revealing more yellowed papers, this time legal documents, property deeds, loan agreements, business registrations. She handed them to James without a word. He hesitated, and then took them, his hands shaking slightly as he read. Page after page, date after date, signature after signature. Each document detailed a financial foundation that predated the Matthews' supposed ownership. There was no denying the handwriting. The seals were authentic, the stamps still visible. His face grew paler with every line he read. "I don't understand," he murmured. "Why would no one talk about this? Why was none of this ever recorded?" "Because no one wanted to believe a black woman could build something this big," she replied. "It was easier to rewrite the truth than to face it." A quiet murmur spread through the room. Some customers began recording on their phones. Others stood still, their expressions ranging from disbelief to quiet shame. Even the employees behind the counter exchanged uncertain glances. Stephen's jaw tightened. He opened his mouth to speak again, but paused, his words caught between defiance and doubt. For the first time, he didn't seem sure. James looked up, locking eyes with Mrs. Kirby. "You've carried this for a long time," he said quietly. She nodded. "Long enough." He looked down again at the documents in his hands, then back at the aged woman standing before him. The evidence was overwhelming. The documents were authentic. And yet, the weight of acknowledging her story felt like the ground shifting beneath his feet. He glanced around the lobby. The eyes of everyone were on him now, waiting to see which way he would lean. The authority figure, the gatekeeper, and for the first time in his career he found himself on the wrong side of history. I need to review all of this," he said, his voice almost a whisper, "carefully, but if what you're saying is true, we can't ignore it." Mrs. Kirby gave a small, solemn nod. "I never asked for pity, only the truth." The tension in the air remained, but it had changed. It was no longer the weight of dismissal, but the beginning of confrontation, of reckoning. A truth buried for over half a century had just resurfaced, and no one could pretend it hadn't. As James gathered the documents and gently closed the ledger, he felt the burden of responsibility settle on his shoulders. The truth was out. The question now was what they would do with it. The chapter ended with no fanfare, no applause, only the heavy reality that something sacred had been broken long ago, and today, piece by piece, it was starting to be rebuilt. The weight in the air of Chase Bank was unbearable. The faded documents that lay on the counter, the worn currency scattered like lost time, and the old ledger open to a page no one could deny. All of it formed a wall of truth too solid to ignore. Yet, disbelief still clung to some in the room like a fog that refused to lift. Mrs. Elijah Kirby stood tall in the middle of it all, her frail frame unmoved, her presence heavier than the years behind her. Every breath she took in that space seemed to echo against walls that had once silenced her. Stephen Miller, the bank's senior security officer, paced slowly near the front entrance. His brows were furrowed, fists clenched at his sides. For a moment, he had lost control of the scene, and that alone ignited something in him, a furious resentment that grew stronger with each second of inaction. He looked around the lobby, expecting others to react as he did, to rise and demand this elderly woman be removed, but instead he saw only silence, uncertainty, and reluctant respect. He stepped forward, sharply, eyes locked on Mrs. Kirby. "This has gone far enough," he snapped. "You've said your piece. You've shown your papers. But this isn't a courtroom. It's a bank. A place of business. And we're done entertaining this madness." James Temp, still holding the bundle of documents, looked up quickly. His face was pale, eyes darting between Stephen and Mrs. Kirby. "Stephen, wait!" "No," Stephen barked, raising a hand to cut him off. "You know how this looks. You're just going to stand there and let her trash the name of this institution? She's manipulating you. All of you." He turned to the rest of the employees, who now watched with growing tension. "Don't you see what's happening here? This is nothing but a well-crafted performance, meant to make us doubt what we've built. Our legacy, our order." No one responded. Not a word. That silence was louder than any argument. "Stephen," Mrs. Kirby said softly, her voice calm and clear, "you may hold a gun on your belt, but I hold the truth in my hands, and it weighs more than you could ever carry." Stephen's face flushed red. His hand moved instinctively to his holster, his fingers wrapping around the grip. "I'm warning you," he said, the threat in his tone now unmistakable. "Leave this place right now, or I will make you." A sharp intake of breath rippled through the lobby. Customers took a cautious step back. One woman held her child closer. Another man looked towards the door as if considering an escape. Even the employees behind the counter stiffened in place, their eyes locked on the weapon now partially drawn. Mrs. Kirby did not flinch. She did not retreat. She stared directly at Stephen, eyes filled not with fear, but with an ancient resolve, the kind forged from a lifetime of standing alone. "I've been threatened before," she said quietly, "but your anger doesn't scare me. It only tells me that the truth is finally cutting through." Stephen's grip on the weapon tightened, knuckles pale. His breath grew heavy, erratic, as if trying to maintain control over a fire he had already stoked too far. Just as he began to draw the gun further, another voice broke the tension. "Put it down, Stephen," James said. He stepped forward, slowly but with purpose, placing himself between Mrs. Kirby and the trembling barrel. "That's an order." Stephen looked at him in disbelief. "You're siding with her?" "I'm siding with the truth," James replied, his voice unshaken. "And what she's shown us is too real to ignore. I've read every page of these documents. They're not forged. They're not fake. And every signature, every seal, every faded mark, it all points to one undeniable fact." He turned toward the rest of the bank. "We've been living under a lie. This bank, this symbol we're so proud of, was stolen. Stolen from the woman standing right here." Stephen's eyes narrowed. "You're going to throw away your career for this?" "If my career is built on lies, then it deserves to fall," James said firmly. Silence followed. Stephen looked around the lobby, but no one came to his defense. The people who once laughed at Mrs. Kirby now stood still, shame growing behind their eyes. He looked at the employees. Not one nodded in support, not even Martin, who earlier had mocked her. It was over. He had lost control, but he wasn't ready to surrender. Not yet. "You're all crazy," he muttered under his breath. "This is suicide. Do you know what the Matthews family will do if they find out we let this happen?" James didn't waver. "They'll try to fight, but the truth is out now. The public will hear. The media, the courts, will fight too." A hush fell again. Then, from behind the counter, Emily Carter stepped forward. She walked past the customers, past her colleagues, and reached the center of the lobby. Without a word, she bent down and picked up one of the old faded banknotes lying on the floor. She examined it in her hand for a moment, then gently placed it beside the ledger. "I trust her," Emily said, her voice small but resolute. "And I'm sorry." Her simple action triggered something. Josh, who had mocked Mrs. Kirby only hours ago, stepped forward next. He took another bill from the floor, walked over, and laid it beside Emily's. "I was wrong," he said. "You deserve better." One by one, the other employees followed. Each silently approached, picked up a bill, and laid it gently on the table beside the ledger. It was more than just an apology. It was a gesture of solidarity, a symbolic act of returning something that was never theirs to begin with. Mrs. Kirby stood still, her eyes welling with emotion but refusing to let tears fall. For over half a century she had carried the weight of silence, of betrayal, of invisibility. And now, finally, there were hands, young, new, uncorrupted, lifting some of that burden with her. Stephen stood at the edge of it all, shoulders tense, breathing ragged. He looked around the room, unable to hide the fury in his eyes. His hand slowly released the grip on the gun, and he lowered his arm. But he said nothing. Not an apology, not a concession. Only the sound of his footsteps as he walked away toward the far side of the lobby. James turned to Mrs. Kirby once more. "I don't know what the next step looks like," he said, "but I promise you, this won't be ignored." She looked at him, her voice barely above a whisper. "That's all I ever asked." And with that, the shift was complete. What had begun as ridicule had become reckoning. The truth had found its voice, and it echoed in every corner of Chase Bank, impossible to silence. The atmosphere inside Chase Bank had changed beyond recognition. What began as a normal afternoon filled with routine transactions and idle conversation had turned into something unforgettable, something transformative. Every customer, every employee, and every manager who remained in the building stood in the aftershock of the truth that had just been unearthed. And at the center of it all stood Mrs. Elijah C.K. Kirby, a woman whose quiet dignity had outshined decades of systemic silence. After the employees had laid down the old banknotes beside the ledger as symbols of apology and respect, no one dared speak. The sounds of machines, of voices, of movement had all faded away. It was a stillness that carried weight. Mrs. Kirby looked down at the stack of bills on the table and then slowly turned her eyes to each person in the room. Her voice, though aged and soft, broke through the silence with unmistakable clarity. "Thank you," she said. "Thank you for listening." The doors of the bank opened once again, and this time a soft breeze slipped through, carrying with it a breath of change. As the quietness stretched, James Temp, the bank manager, turned to the group of employees who had stood by him. His face was pale but steady. He had made a choice and was prepared to see it through, no matter the cost. He stepped back from the counter and addressed them all. "I want everyone to know that I am taking these documents directly to the board of directors," James said. "I'm prepared to stand by them. If the board tries to deny this or cover it up, I will go public. I'll speak to the press. I'll take it to court if I have to." The room didn't erupt in applause. Instead, there was a quiet chorus of nods, murmured support, and determined expressions. The shift that had started with one voice was now finding roots in many. Emily Carter stood at James's side, followed by Josh and several others. Their presence, once symbolic, had now become something more. It was a line in the sand. "I know this won't be easy," James continued. "The Matthews family won't accept it quietly. Their name is too deeply tied to this bank, to this city. But it's not about comfort. It's about doing what's right." Mrs. Kirby stepped closer to the center of the room. She glanced around, her eyes locking with those who had once doubted her. Then she turned to James. "For over 50 years, I lived with the pain of being erased," she said. "I built this place from nothing. I worked beside John Williams with hope, believing our vision would make a difference. I believed that fairness could overcome fear. I was wrong. The moment this bank started to thrive, I became invisible. They told me it wasn't about me, that my face didn't belong on the front page, that my hands weren't the right ones to lead." She paused, the memories surfacing with a visible weight. "I lost more than my business. I lost my name. I lost my place in this world. And when I fought back, I found doors closed, judges disinterested, and voices louder than mine deciding who deserved to be remembered. I lived through the silence, but I never gave up hope." Emily's eyes filled with tears as she listened. Josh looked down at the floor, ashamed of the things he had once said. A customer nearby wiped his eyes, then turned toward his young daughter standing beside him, explaining in a whisper what was happening. Mrs. Kirby looked toward the large glass window at the front of the bank, the late afternoon sunlight spilling onto the floor. She smiled faintly as though seeing something far away. Then she turned back to the group and placed her hand gently on the ledger. "I didn't come here today to seek revenge," she said. "I came to restore what was mine. I came so that no other woman, no other person, would have to disappear the way I did." James nodded. "And from this moment forward, we will make sure your name is never forgotten again." A wave of quiet resolution passed through the room. Stephen Miller remained in the corner, arms folded, his jaw tight, but he said nothing. The fury in his eyes had dimmed into something else, confusion perhaps, or the first flicker of shame. He no longer held the power in that room. It had shifted, not into new hands, but into truth's hands. Mrs. Kirby bent down slowly and picked up her old canvas bag. She placed the ledger inside with reverence, followed by the yellowed papers and worn banknotes. The bag sagged with age and history, but she carried it as though it were weightless now. She turned toward the door, walking with steady steps past the people who once mocked her, now silent with respect. As she reached the exit, the employees stepped aside. Customers did too. Some lowered their heads. Others simply watched with expressions of quiet awe. The sun lit her face as she stepped through the door and onto the street beyond, her shadow long but proud behind her. Inside, James stood motionless for a long moment, staring at the space she had left. He turned to Emily and the others. "We have work to do," he said. "A lot of it." They all understood. This was not the end. It was the beginning of something far greater than any of them had anticipated. Legal battles were coming. The Matthews family would not go down without a fight. The board of directors would not surrender their power willingly, but Chase Bank would never be the same again. The following morning, James entered the executive boardroom carrying the documents Mrs. Kirby had provided. The tension was immediate. Faces turned toward him, some curious, others hostile. The Matthews family sat at the head of the table, their patriarch, Gregory Matthews, already scowling before James had even begun. One by one, James laid out the evidence, the ledger, the bills, the deeds, the court records, and the truth. The room erupted with protest, denial, and anger. But James didn't flinch. He stood tall, fueled not by pride, but by the responsibility of doing what was right. News spread fast. The story of Elijah C.K. Kirby reached the press within days. Public outrage grew. Protests began outside the bank. Investigations were launched. And Mrs. Kirby, now the face of justice long denied, became a symbol for thousands. She never asked for fame. All she had ever wanted was acknowledgement. And now, finally, she had it. She had reclaimed her place in history not through violence, not through vengeance, but through truth, carried in an old canvas bag and spoken with the voice of someone who refused to be forgotten. The people who once doubted her now stood beside her, and though many battles still lay ahead, one thing had changed forever. The truth was no longer silent, and the name Elijah C.K. Kirby would never be erased again. Let me know if you'd like an epilogue or final reflection to conclude the story. What began as a quiet afternoon turned into a powerful reckoning with history. Her voice, once silenced, now echoes across generations. If this story touched your heart, give it a like, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and make sure to subscribe for more powerful stories like this one. Drop a comment below. We'd love to know where you're watching from and what you felt.